Okay, so good morning, and here we are in the beautiful city of Venice, the Serenissima, as they call it, and we're going to see how just the particular atmosphere and climate of Venice is going to change very much the way the painters address their works. So let's look at some of the notes, and I hope you have seen that by now. Thanks to Bill Malander, I'm now giving you access to a copy of the historic notes, so you can uh, have some solid, solid proof of what I'm sending you, and hopefully that works for you. So let's look at Venice in the 16th century. Actually, the decline of Venice started earlier, around the time when the Ottoman invaded Constantinople. But we have to remember that the Ottoman had already invaded the whole region around Constantinople before finally being able to break the siege in 1453. But this is going to result in the Ottoman-Venetian War. The Venice had particular ties with Constantinople and a lot of trading. And so they're going to try to push out the Ottomans, but this will not succeed, as we know. But that series of conflicts between the Ottomans and Venice will last literally from 1396 to 1718. And finally will cost Venice most of its Eastern Mediterranean possessions. Also, on the other side, Venice is going to lose its monopoly to the Portuguese after Vasco da Gama first voyage around 1497 to 99, which opened a sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope, so going down, all the way down Africa, passing the Cape of Good Hope, and then going on to India. And of course, this is going to break what Venice had done, which was that incredible trading route with all the East. And it was often the recipient of all these, the things like the Silk Roads, the end of the Silk Road, and the trading with the Middle East. Also, a problem that Venice had was dealing typically internally with light constructed oarsmen galleys. They worked very well for them, but once the Portuguese and the Netherlandish population came with these very larger sailing ship, they couldn't compete with it. Another point is that the Black Death, which had devastated Venice in 1348, came back multiple times. And so we have, again, in between 1575 and 77, we have 50,000 people that are going to die. And the other bouts of plague prior to that, we know that in 1510, we'll see that Giorgione will die of the plague. So it was coming and going. Venice was known for its freedom from religious fanaticism. As you know, at the end of the let's say in the beginning of the 16th century, the Reformation starts in the northern Europe. But the state of Venice was liberal enough that it never executed anyone for religious heresy, even during the Counter Reformation, though it did have some pogroms of Jewish population. It kept it pretty much bound for a long time. A very important point was the printing press. Very quickly, the printing press that had been developed in Nuremberg came to Venice and very quickly developed incredibly. The most important of these printers was Aldus Pius Manutius, who was the founder of the Aldine Press. He particularly insisted in publishing and disseminating rare text in Greek and Latin. And the reason why he liked that was the fact that he thought that these versions were not corrupted by translation and were pretty pure text going back to the classical writers. So he also developed what is called the Enchiridia, that was literally the predecessor of modern paperbacks and were books that could be carried by people, even on horseback or whatever, and were not some of these enormous. Let me see if I have anybody coming in. No. So didn't have any of these huge books that could not be carried around. So this was quite an important invention. And then we look very quickly at the social profile in Venice. Some of the new things was, for example, that the dowries were getting so huge that when people had many daughters, they were only able to marry the eldest daughter if she wanted to. Sometimes she had no choice. And so the dowry defined the fact that only one daughter in the family was able to get married, and all the others would typically end up in convents. Now, convents was another story in the 16th century. Some were very legitimate convents that were often populated by women that really were attracted by the dogmas or by the rules of certain monasteries, but also because so many women that couldn't get married went there, some of these convents turned literally on a type of brothels. And there are incredible stories telling that these convents had open doors and the monks were going in and out very frequently. To the point that some people were really saying that some convents should be burned to the ground with their inhabitants. That takes us to the fact of rampant prostitution, and you can understand why. You know, Venice was a harbor, very huge harbor, so a lot of travelers, a lot of people that came that were single, and so the prostitution was quite an institution in Venice, and at a different level. So you had very poor prostitute for poor people, but you had very high-ranked prostitute that were really searched by the nobility of Venice. So quite interesting. And by the way, I'm going to give you the references of it's a large book on Titian, but it has quite a whole chapter dedicated to Venice itself. And I think it's quite interesting. So beside the problem between the Ottomans and the Venetians, there were also some constant wars and combats between different states and Venice. And so there we can see, I think it's really ironic when you look at these military alliances. In 1509 came together the League of Cambrai against Venice. And who was against Venice? The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, Louis XII, King of France, Ferdinand I, King of Spain, and the Pope, Julius II. They allied against Venice. Guess what? The year after, there's the Holy League against France. So it's literally Venice and Pope Julius II that turn around and go after France. By 1515, you have France and Venice that get together against other enemies at the Battle of Marignano that Francis I is going to win. And then it finishes with the Treaty of Noyon and Brussels that takes all the changes that had happened in the last 6 years back to before 1509. And so the territories that had been shifted between these powers are going to go back to prior 1509. So these are really interesting. It shows you that you have constant fight and feud. Here's an interesting map that shows you, and I don't like the coloring of it, by the way. You have Venice here, and you can see how far the trade was going on ground and on the sea. Sorry, not what I wanted to be. There we are. So you can see how far away, and would go, for example, all the way to Flanders. This would turn all around the Iberian Peninsula, France and so on, and probably go to the northern part of Portugal, then northern coast of Africa. And then you have that outlet there in the east to the Middle East and the Holy Land, etc., the Levant, as they call it. Then going north through the Black Sea and Constantinople, they would extend all the way to what is now Russia, and could go on all the way to the east, to China and the other countries. So it was a very, very much an incredible hub for traders until the Portuguese and the Dutch came about. So let's look at Venice. And we're so lucky that in 1500, a printer, Jacopo de Barbari, made this map of Venice. It's a huge map. It's almost 7 feet in length and probably about 3 feet in height, made of 6 blocks, of woodcut blocks, and shows the whole city of Venice and the surrounding islands. Now, what is exceptional about it, and I think with that very large image, you can see it, is every single house in the city of Venice is represented there in almost 3D dimensions. What is superb is that Jacopo de Barbari presents the city as if he was on a hot air balloon, which we know wasn't the case, but he was able to record it in such a way that he shows us every single house in Venice. So it's bigger than what I said. It's 135 centimeters, or 1.35 by 2.82 meters. And so it gives us even the idea of the height of the towers. So let's look at this part. This is the Grand Canal, of course, that goes all across that part. And here is the Arsenal that we'll talk about in a minute. You see that great traffic of galleys and galleons. And here is, for example, the representation of the Piazza San Marco with the Basilica, as well as the Doge Palace and the Campanile. Quite an incredible feat to be able to do this. Of course, Venice was an attraction for many artists, and at the end of the 16th century, we see a perspective view of Venice and the lagoon by Hogenberg, who was a Dutch map creator. And he gives us an idea, but you can see it's far less detailed than by the Jacopo de Barbari. Just want to point out the island of Murano, which was already the island where they were making glass and beautiful glasses and other objects in that very extraordinary method. And then at the end is the Arsenal. And the Arsenal was something very unique in Europe at that time. So just this gives you an idea. This is a later engraving by Johan Blau, who is also Dutch, and shows us an idea of that incredible industry that happened there. When you think they could lay down the keel of a galley in the morning, the keel was already built to standard design with stock parts, and launch it the same evening, fully rigged and ready to put to sea. And that's absolutely amazing. So they had really the chain work, and they were able to have an incredible output of ships. Now, we talked about the fact that in Venice, they were using mostly oarsmen ships. And so I'm going to show you an idea of what it was. So they did have sails. They had already invented the triangular sail, which was different to the Roman square one. And here you have the oars, and sometimes had 3 different levels of oars. So coming back to art, so now we have a little idea what Venice was about. What do we find in art in Venice at that time? We still find the tradition of the past. And of course, they have, in the 16th century, they have a family that had dominated painting. And I'm talking about the Bellini family, starting with Jacopo early on, and then Gentile and Giovanni. So that's the tradition of the past. But very quickly, because of the numerous contacts they have with the North, a lot of Flemish artists are going to come through Venice when they come down to Italy. They discover new styles. And they're going to develop their very own style. It is often, at least early on, very ambiguous, is evocative. It shows some nostalgia for the classical past. We see often referral to the extraordinary mosaic, for example, the one from the San Marco, but also that beautifully represented and demonstrated pastoral landscapes. And then very expressive portraits that we will find. Titian is an incredible portraitist that will be researched by all the rich people and important people of Europe. So timeline. I put Leonardo da Vinci at the top, and you can see the colors, Leonardo da Vinci being from around Florence. I put it in red, and all the others are from the Venice region. Leonardo came by Venice in 1500. In 1500, as you've seen on previous things I showed you, there was war in Milan where he was. And so he fled the city before the city was invaded by some of the troops. And fleeing to the east, he went through Mantua, met with Isabella d'Este, and who was begging him to stay. She was a woman who put an enormous importance in culture and art, and Leonardo had already an incredible fame. But Leonardo decided he didn't want to stay there. He went all the way to Venice before going back south. In Venice, he will meet with Giorgione, that we can see down here. So 1500 is the line that we see here. Mantegna was at that time in Mantua, so he might have met him in Mantua when he went through. But Giovanni Bellini in 1500 still had an extremely active workshop that actually is going to use as assistant or as apprentice most of the figures that you see here, the next 4, Vittore Carpaccio, Giorgione, Titian, and Palmavecchio. So here you have an idea, the incredibly long career of Titian, and unfortunately the incredibly short career of Giorgione, who is going to die of the plague in 1510. At the very bottom, you see the names of Tintoretto and Veronese, who we're not going to touch today, but I always like to put them as a referral. So you have an idea where they stand. We'll talk about them next time. Great artists too that were absolutely the legacy of Titian and Giorgione, etc. So I bring back 2 important works, late works of Giovanni Bellini. They dated 1505 and the other one a little later. This is the absolutely magnificent San Zaccaria altarpiece with this very classicizing architecture. This is the Renaissance, but a recall of the magnificent mosaics that you find in different places in Venice, particularly in St. Mark. What happens towards the end, Giovanni Bellini was an extraordinary artist, but also a very smart person. And he became aware of the talent of Giorgione, for example, that was an assistant of his, and started looking at what Giorgione was inventing. And so here, for the first time, we see really Bellini introducing some landscape behind the architecture. And we can admire how Bellini, departing from his ancestors skill-wise, if we can say, he's able to give that humanity to the figures that he represents. So Mary and the child become real persons and not just an icon. The same with the saints that surround her. And of course, we are in Venice, so you will have some musical angels that are playing, in this case, a chord instrument. And the really superb use of color that is so typical of Giovanni Bellini. The next work, dated 1514, is an interesting piece. It is actually on canvas. In most of his career, Giovanni Bellini worked on panels. But by that time, many painters had switched to canvas. It was lighter and allowed a different technique than wood. In these works that might have been actually finished hand in hand with Giorgione, called the Feast of Gods. And we see a whole series of known gods with, of course, a whole series of little history in the whole piece that tells you on the right, for example, you have Priapus, who's trying to take advantage of the sleeping nymph. These are works that are actually commissioned for the Duke Alfonso d'Este, who is trying to decorate one of the small rooms of his palace in Ferrara with paintings by the best painters around. And so Giovanni Bellini will be one of them, but we'll see that he will call on Titian to go on decoration of his works. So what happens is that a lot of these artists are now being totally in touch, and the patrons, by the way, in touch with the classical literature. And Ovid's Fasti, the feast, is a very long poem that recounts the origin of many ancient Roman rites and festivals. And here, Ovid is describing a banquet given by the god of wine, and literally cites an incident that embarrassed Priapus, the god of virility. Priapus is a very interesting figure that is not too much known, mostly shied about. People are shy about him because they wear some very graphic images of him. And so with the Victorian era, he's kind of being put on the margin, not to make the women blush. So the story here, it's adorable. You have the nymph Lotis, who is showing falling asleep. And during that time, Priapus comes and he puts his hand up her thigh, as you can see. At that time, the donkey that you see on the other side is going to start making a very raucous braying and giving out what Priapus is doing. And so everybody, all the gods around are going to start laughing and make fun of Priapus, who was known for these type of things. So an interesting, very decorative piece that is supposed to be part of these cabinets and becomes literally a conversation piece. So people would stand in front of it and start exchanging philosophical ideas. I'm going to present you, before going to Giorgione and Titian, a painter who had some incidents on their career and their taste. He was, Vittore Carpaccio was also part of the workshop of first Gentile, Bellini, and then Giovanni. He was born in 1472 in Venice. He was the son of Piero Scarpazza, a leather merchant, and changed his name once he entered the humanist circles of Venice, and he changed his name to Carpaccio. He is a pupil of Bellini and very quickly showed a lot of talent, and so was asked to paint a lot of these large series. And one is on the legend of Sin Ursula for the Venetian Scuola di San Orsola. Orsola in Italian is Ursula. And keep in mind, when we say scuola, it's not a school. These are buildings that would house different kind of, not really guilds, but these were specific to Venice. These were groups that were very formal and were taking care often of the poor and the people that had problems. So they would gather, have these buildings, and they wanted to decorate them. So this is the legend of St. Ursula for the scuola of the same name. In 1502 to 1507, he's going to paint some episode of the life of three patron saints, St. Jerome, St. George, and St. Tryphon, who were originally Dalmatian. And this will be for the Scuola di San Giorgio degli Schiavoni. So in that case, again, these are a whole series to decorate the inside of these scuole. Between 1511 and 1520, he will finish 5 panels on the life of St. Stephen for the Scuola di Santo Stefano, and will die in 1526 at still a too young age, but normal for that time, in Capodistria. He was known to use mostly canvas rather than panels. So he is really one of the ones with Mantegna too, that used the newcomer canvas. So I'm going to show you just a few works by him. This is the Dream of St. Ursula, so for the Scuola of the same name. The subjects are drawn from the golden legend of Jacopo da Voragine. As you know, in the 13th century, Jacopo da Voragine had written that kind of oral tradition that was going around and tried to put it all together. And you can still find actually these legenda aurea, or the golden legends. It's in print, and where you find the life of most saints. And so these were always, the book was so important for artists that would go there, learn about their lives and about the miracles that they made. And this is showing the dream of Sin Ursula. So Sin Ursula is in bed, and you have the angel very Botticelli-like coming in. It's very interesting when you see with Vittore Carpaccio is the detail that he gives into this room, and you can really imagine the architecture and the design in that time. So you have these small pieces of glass, really thick, that are crowning, if you want, the windows, and you have plants at the windows, and these are the chandeliers, and the door opens to the next door, to the next room. And then here you have a table, so where she can read with the candle again next to it. So it's really interesting to see these very little domestic side to his representation. One of his most known work is the one that he did for the confraternity of the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista. That was one of the most respected confraternity at that time, and they called on a whole series of known painters such as Pietro Perugino, Vittore Carpaccio, Gentile, Bellini, and then others that are less known to you. And they wanted altogether 9 canvases for the great hall of their headquarters in the subject was the miracles of the Holy Cross, the story of miracles that were performed by the fragments of the wood from the cross on which Jesus was crucified. That particular fragment had been donated to the Brotherhood in 1369 by Philippe de Mézières, who was Chancellor of the Kingdom of Cyprus and Jerusalem. And this became very quickly an extremely important object of veneration, particularly, and became the symbol of the scuola. So some of these, unfortunately, some of these paintings appeared, including the one of Perugino. So the subject here is the, they call that telero when it's a particular subject that has to do with relics, story of the relics, is the healing of a man possessed. And it's performed by Francesco Querini, who was the patriarch of the scuola. And so actually what is interesting is you see only up on the left the happening of that man who is mad and who is going to be cured by the representation here is the reliquary. And just in seeing it and maybe touching the reliquary, he will be cured. And you have all kind of deacons around that are the witness to the miracle. But for us, what is really interesting is that view of Venice. What you see here in wood is the old Rialto Bridge before it crumbled a few years later. It was replaced by a stone bridge that opened in 1592, but he collapsed in 1524. What is interesting, you have the equivalent of a drawbridge in the middle that could be raised when the toll wanted to go by. So also interesting to see the architecture, the particular shape of the chimneys that emanate from all these beautiful buildings. And for those that are familiar with the Grand Canale, you have some known houses such as the foundation of the Tedeschi, so that's house that was dedicated to the German tradesmen. You can look at everything here and really see the crowd that is there with the extraordinary costume for some. Even you can see here that gondola that is led by a black man. So very interesting for us to look at. The next work that we see is part of the these series of painting on the three Dalmatian saints. It's St. George baptizing the Selenite. And this is a lesser known miracle that he did, but it's quite interesting because we see the interest of Carpaccio on exoticism, and not very difficult when you see these people with big turbans. And of course, that's that contrast of them compared to people that put their turban down and are going to be converted by St. George, who is on these steps. Of course, the whole attraction to Orientalism comes from what was happening with Constantinople by that time, Istanbul. Another work, and this already introduced what we're going to see with Giorgione and some of the Titian work, but probably mostly Giorgione, is the portrait of a knight, where we see that young man standing with his legs slightly apart. He's shown why he's unsheaths his sword. He dominates the landscape that is behind him, but look at the detail of the landscape with all kinds of flowers, lilies and other irises and other flowers that are very delicately painted. And this, of course, takes us right away to the north and shows that a very important influence of Flemish painters and their love for detail and of minutiae, the rendering of all that minutiae, that had made its way to Venice. So it's rendered very accurately. The lines, definitely the young knight is quite detached from the landscape that is behind. We see another young knight on the horse with the lance. We can see even here the galloping horse that is actually showing the it's the insignia, the wooden sign, probably for a restaurant or a hotel. And then you see all kind of animals all around the lagoon. So it's quite interesting, because what does that mean? There's written on the paper that is down here, malo moriquam fedari, better to die than to lose one's honor. And that honor was something, concept that was extremely important in that time. And so maybe that's what it tries to show, that with the hermine, which is the symbol of purity and integrity, you have the peacock, that is a reference to here, just next to the helmet of the young knight. It's a symbol of eternity. And so these are all an emblem, and it's very difficult to know exactly what Carpaccio meant, but it's something we find in Venice at the time, these very cryptic type of representation. In the 10,000 Martyrs on the Mount of Ararat, is quite interesting. This one comes from the demolished church of San Antonio di Castello. And the other piece, he tells the story of the Roman soldiers who converted to Christianity and were then sent to die by their own emperor, in league with the rulers of the East. And it celebrates the glory won during the Turkish wars by the family of the donor Ettore Ottobon, that is represented here on the side. So a terrible image where we see all these soldiers that have been crucified or attached and are awaiting for death. And then an image here on the top of the hill. And this very anthropomorphic type of landscape is also very Flemish, by the way. When here you see angels under that very strange, almost like a UFO up in the sky. Carpaccio was asked to paint the Lion of San Marco. Of course, this is one of the big symbols of Venice. This is again Tempest on canvas. We see the large lion. Obviously, he had not seen a lion in his life, but it's very much of a heraldic lion with the wings. This is, of course, the symbol of Saint Mark. The beast is always accompanying Saint Mark. We see all the maritime life on the right, and here a very good representation of the Doge Palace, the campanile and the domes of the Saint Mark Basilica. This was painted in 1516 for the magistrate of the Camerling in the Rialto, and is now in the Doge Palace. This, of course, symbolizes the power on land and sea of the Venetian Republic. As you can see, the hind legs are in the water, the one on the ground and the other one on the book that talks about peace, pax. Very different is the death of Christ. Here we can, I think, appreciate the use of the color by Carpaccio. Apparently, by the end of his career, he was less of a talent of a colorist, let's say, than he was before, except when the subject was really attracting him. So we can see here the three crosses on top of the Mount of the Golgotha. And then the whole series of cameos of things that are happening. This is supposed to be where Christ is going to be buried. And in the meantime, he's on that large bench, if you want, and with people that are around dressed in different ways, either contemporary clothing or in this case, it looks like St. Jerome, if you want, but it wasn't St. Jerome. That is barely dressed at all. It's St. Job, sorry, not St. Jerome. So when Carpaccio died, this is really when Titian came about. But before we move to Titian, we have to talk about Giorgione, who is an amazing artist. Unfortunately, he had a very short life. As you can see, he died at 32 years of age, 31, 32. He was born in Castelfranco as Giorgio da Castelfranco. Giorgione means Great George. He trained in the workshop of Giovanni Bellini and met Leonardo during his visit in Venice. One thing I have to say is Giorgione had the reputation of being an extremely handsome man, which must not have displeased Leonardo. He shared the studio with Vincenzo Catena, a lesser known artist, and between 1507 and 1508 was employed with other artists of his generation to decorate with frescoes the exterior of the newly rebuilt Fondaco dei Tedeschi. This was a habit at that time, and it's interesting when you know how humid Venice is that they would do this fresco that couldn't sustain that kind of a weather, because even if the pigment is absorbed by the plaster itself would peel, and finally the frescoes would be very easily damaged. So similar works had been done before on different of the houses along the canal, the Casa Soranzo, Casa Grimania, I Servi, and other Venetian palace. And he will unfortunately be taken away much too early when he died of the plague in 1510 and was buried on one of the two islands that were dedicated to people dying of contagious diseases. He was influenced by Giovanni Bellini and Vittore Carpaccio, definitely Flemish painting too, and will be known for small oil paintings. He wasn't painting on a large scale. No, because he died so unexpectedly and he worked very close to Titian, the late works were probably finished by Titian himself, but it's difficult to differentiate them at the end of his short career. So let's look at that young man. This is a self-portrait, and you can see a man with very regular features, pretty symmetrical, but beautiful features, strong nose, very pretty lips, and then long cascading hair. And when men had really beautiful hair and were handsome, they often let the hair grow pretty long. So this is an interesting painting because, as you see, the title is Self-Portrait as David, though the painting itself doesn't show it because it has been cut down since Giorgione painted it. And we only know it because we have a print that was made in 1650 by Wenceslaus Holler of Giorgione's Self-Portrait as David. And so this is the way it was. We're missing the head of Goliath in that painting, but this is the way it would have looked as a painting. Very interesting face. I'm going to show you, there are not very many paintings by him that are actually signed. There's very few. I think just one, in fact, but has been attributed to him by because of a particular style and use of pigments and so on. And that's still changing. Some paintings that were attributed to Titian went back to Giorgione and reciprocally. So here is altarpiece that he painted about the enthroned Madonna and Child with St. Francis and St. Liberale. Again, influence of the Flemish people. This is the landscape that you find at the back. The research for the detail in that very nice cloth coming down from the throne. The piece is not signed, but the authorship is indisputable just by the technique of his painting technique, where he would lay down some very delicately coats of paint without any underlying scaffolding of a drawing. This is something we see developing in Venice, whereas in Florence, everything was drawn before it was painted on. In Venice, they often just elaborate an idea of the shapes with the brush, with some paint, and then build on it. We can see some similarities with Bellini in the way, the very lively way of the figures and the crisp representation here of the throne and the Virgin. But he's, on the other hand, he's departing with the technique, the painting technique. Here is a comparison with Bellini, so you can see how crisp is the Bellini painting. This is the San Giobbe altarpiece, but compared to this one that already has a different scale. It's a very different type of work. The most known and the most debated painting by Giorgione is, of course, the Tempest. This is an absolute representation of poesia, so poetry. And it's considered as the very first landscape, if you want, in painting, not only in Venice, but in the known world at that time. I'm not fully in agreement with that, because there are some landscapes by that time in Northern Europe too. But people, the Italian scholars are always party for their own people. So this is a really, as I say, big debate of what does it mean. It shows in a very beautiful landscape, a young woman who is half nude and who is nursing a child. There is a little creek, and now the other creek is that young man holding a staff, and that is most probably a shepherd. At first, it was thought he would be a soldier, but it's supposed by now to be a shepherd. The architecture around is quite interesting, because you have that wall with two broken columns on it, and a building that is very much early Renaissance on the left, and then the bridge that crosses the creek, some architecture, and then that incredible sky, very dark, and apparently the first lightning represented in painting too. So what did it mean? And we, of course, he's not there to tell us what he meant by that, but often these related to some texts that were either contemporary or classical texts, and would represent different ideas more than just a figure. So the nude woman has been qualified as Eve, Venus, Ceres, or Charity, and Charity often was shown as a woman nursing a child, or an adult, by the way. The man that was carrying a halberd is not really a halberd, it's a large staff. And then you have the storm with lightning that could be a symbol for war, unpredictable fortune. The broken column would be Fortitude, and the tower has been that is present there shows the arms of the Carrara family. So some believe that it could relate to a statement of the Doge Loredan asking young men to take up arms to regain Padua, which had been lost due to a fatal tempest. This is a possibility. So it should, oh, sorry, why that mouse is not correct. I don't know. No? So it's not on that one. There we are. So here we have a blow up and we can see very neatly the little baby suckling his mother, who seems pretty indifferent, which is quite interesting. Now, for a while, the man that we see on the other side was considered as a soldier. But when an X-ray of the underpainting was taken, it shows that, in fact, originally there was another woman on the side, and you can see her kneeling on the other side of the creek. And then she's been painted on top to get the young men. So this even furthers the questions of scholars on the painting. Also advanced by some other scholars is the fact that Giorgione must for sure have seen this marble bas-relief of the divine condemnation and destiny of the progenitors after the original sin, where we see Eve on the ground there suckling Cain. So definitely, and we know that artists go around and are inspired by some works by previous artists. So extraordinary, it's a small painting. And when you go to the Accademia in Venice, they tell you when you come in, the Tempest is over there, because you could go by it without seeing it, it's so small. He was also a portraitist. This is the portrait of a young woman nicknamed Laura. And again, quite interesting because you have some oleander behind. So a lot of symbolism. She's showing a breast and seems to be really looking to the right for her. But that contrast of the fur, the fabric, that very light scarf that she wears around the neck, the hair that is kind of tossed and coming to the neck. It's absolutely beautiful and must have been quite appreciated because I love these. It can be seen, and you can see it here if you follow my mouse there, part of the collection of the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm in his gallery in Brussels. The Archduke had one of the largest collection of painting. It had two different galleries, one for Italian works, some for Flemish works. And these are such interesting painting. This is by David Teniers in the mid-17th century that shows the Archduke with the hat. He was the only one allowed to wear a hat in his presence. The two little dogs going around, of course, and Teniers himself, who is on the side and showing him because he became the custodian of the collection. So very interesting paintings, and we will see in a minute that another of the works by Giorgione is also part of the collection. It shows you the interest too. By the way, the whole collection moved, and you can see it is in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. This is one of the reasons why all these paintings are in the Kunsthistorisches. It was gathered by Leopold Wilhelm. And when he left Brussels, he took all his art with him to Vienna. Very contrasted with it is this painting of the old woman. And look at the realism of that painting, showing that really damaged onto the skin with age, and the missing teeth, and that look of despair in her eyes is quite interesting, because on a really background, you could look at that and say this could almost be a Rembrandt in a sense. Very interesting, that the very subtle gradation of color on the little scroll that she holds in her hand is col tempo, which means with time. That suggested that, it is the fading beauty over the years, but it's an extraordinary work. Here we getting to the time just before Giorgione passed away. A very known work, the Pastoral Concert, the Fête Champêtre in French. It's at the Louvre and is attributed to Giorgione or Titian. And this tells you how similar their art was at around 1510. And it's a really interesting image where we see these two nude women, and then the two dressed men with a musical instrument, and then in the background, a beautiful landscape with shepherd and flock and very lush trees. So what again is the meaning of that painting? It also refers to poetry. Again, opinions are divergent concerning first who is the creator of the painting and its theme. But it's really one of the masterpieces of the Venetian Renaissance. First example of modern pastoral painting, it's an allegory of nature, but definitely the message is more complex. The two, as I say, you have the two female figures that could be the muses of poetry, and their nakedness would reveal them as divine beings that are in fact just a vision for the young musicians and poets. So the well-dressed youth that you see there playing a lute is probably the poet that is exalted by the lyricism of the music and the words. And we can consider, in fact, these two women, as I say, just be a vision with them in their eyes. Landscape is again very much inspired by Flemish paintings. So this is definitely a pastoral painting, probably derived from Poetica by Aristotle. And it's quite interesting, and we can't judge it on this painting like this, but it shows a lot of impasto. And this is a new thing. Definitely with Titian, we're going to see a lot of impasto, particularly at the end of his life. But I think what we can appreciate is that harmony of the scenery, the figures, the colors, the forms, and that close interrelationship between man, nature, poetry, and music. Finally, and this is really a work that I would say, in a sense, changed the painting of nudes in Europe, because it had a lot of followers all the way to the 19th century with Manet. But again, here we have that figure. We assume it's Venus, because that would have been the only excuse to show a nude woman. She's asleep or close to be asleep on that beautiful cover, red cover on the right, and then the kind of bed sheets under her, and a very lush landscape in the background, again, quite inspired by Flemish painting, because you have even thatched roof, which is not something you find in the northern of Italy. The sensuality of Venice is there, heightened by very red lips, the very deep red velvet of that blanket behind her, and then the white satin drapery on which her body lies with that very creamy color of the flesh. Her sleep implies dreaming and the transport of the figure within another world. This would be equivalent to what of the writings by Polyphilus, the Dream of Polyphilus, sorry, by Aldus Manutius, that was published in Venice in 1499. Also, some people might just question her hand at her genitals. That would be a symbol of fertility. The fact of caressing herself was apparently helping a future fertility for a young woman. Often these paintings had to do with young couples' marriage. Would be set in a place where it could be seen almost only by themselves. Typically, for example, the cassone. The cassone is that a bride would bring at her marriage. These were these beautiful painted chests that were contain the whole trousseau, so her dresses and underwear and everything that was prepared before she got married, often had in the cover the image of Venus or Venus and Mars. And another very interesting painting showing the three philosophers by Giorgione, also dated 1509. This is shortly before he died. Was finished by Sebastiano del Piombo after his death. And again, has been a source of disagreement between scholars, because what you can see could represent the three ages of men, where you have an older man with a long beard, you have a middle-aged man there, and then a young one sitting down and looking, and by the way, who looks very much like Giorgione himself. Now, this painting, again, belonged to the, and of course, I want to stress the beautiful landscape on the left. This painting was also part, and you can see it here on the right, part of the collection of Leopold Wilhelm. So before we move into Titian, I think it's time to take a little break. I'll have to rush a little bit there because I really wanted you to understand the beginning. So please unmute yourself and give me a question. I give you 5 minutes, not more. So please have some questions or some remarks, whatever. Unmute yourself if you want to talk.
And
yes, Bill.
How could you transfer a painting? I think you said this is true of a Bellini painting as you began. How could you transfer it from wood to canvas?
That's a very good point, and it's a very difficult technique. It's the same as from fresco to canvas. These are difficult. They have to put some very fine fabric that with a kind of a light glue and apply it to the painting so that the pigment doesn't fall off. And then the multiple layers of that fabric, then finally they go behind and they literally almost use a saw, to go for a very thin layer and then reapply the whole thing to canvas. It's extremely complicated, and I didn't give it justice, but it's one of the biggest fear for any conservator to do is to detach a fresco or detach a piece from a wooden support to a canvas. The wooden support, often the reason to do it is because suddenly the wood goes and starts rotting for a reason that you don't know. or has a disease. And so they had to do it. If they can avoid it, believe me, they would. I love the works of Giorgione. You always wonder what they would have done did they live longer. John, you have no question?
No, I was looking at that Carpaccio, the Dead Christ.
Yes.
Surprised I could not make sense of they have Christ sitting on a bench,
Kind of large settees.
structure, and you have the head, the skulls, 3 or 4 skulls under the bench, and
yeah, but these really interesting. That's why they talk about having so much symbolism at that time that gets lost on us, because if you don't have a user manual, if you can say it, it's impossible to understand exactly what they were making and why. So that's the particular school, and you see it with Giorgione too. You have also some of these things there, and you wonder, what is that? It's so it must refer to some writings that they've seen, and that we cannot identify.
yeah. Now the symbolism is the trick of many of these paints, because for us to understand them today is a challenge.
Oh, it is a huge challenge.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Anybody else has a question? Jerry, you don't have a question? No? Okay, so if nobody, I hope you have just the time to get another cup of coffee or stretch your legs. But we're going to jump into the works of Titian. And of course, Titian has that huge career. I'm going to ask you to, I'll do it. I can do it myself. Is mute you back so we're not distracted by some odd noise. And moving to Titian, he had a huge career. He died a little older than Michelangelo. So it's incredible. So 86, a life span of 86 years at that time was almost unheard of. But he became such an incredible painter, so versatile, touching different things like he's going. And I've split actually the works by category so we can really appreciate it. We have religious painting, of course, because the church was mostly, we said about over 50% of the works by painter was for the church. But he became one of the biggest portraitists in Europe, if not the biggest. And then, of course, he also does these mythological works and allegorical works that are very interesting and very different. So he was, at the end of his career, considered as the sun amidst small stars, not only among the Italians, but all the painters of the world. And that's Lamazzo, who was a great writer, who gave him that great title. He was born a little outside of Venice in Pieve di Cadore, as Tiziano Vecellio, which is his full name. From a well-to-do family, they were patriarchs, and they were people in charge of a lot of high-level administration titles in Pieve di Cadore. Tiziano always loved his city of Cadore and would go back there regularly. And I think this is also how he avoided the plague that killed Giorgione. As a young boy, together with his brother, he came down from Pieve di Cadore into Venice around 1500. Started with Gentile Bellini, the older brother, and then by the younger one, Giovanni Bellini, where he met Giorgione. In 1511, he had a small journey to Padua, and returned to Venice in 1512. He became, in 1516, the official painter to the Republic, and I think this is after the death of Giovanni Bellini. He worked for Alfonso d'Este between 1518 and 23. The Ferrara was not very far. He had married a woman, had multiple children, and she died, unfortunately, in 1530. It is believed that he remarried, but we know nothing about a possible second wife. All we know is that his standard for women changed after his wife died, went from a rather plump view to a much thinner and elegant standard. He met with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in Bologna in 1530. And Charles V really was impressed by him, and they really started almost a friendship, you would say. Charles V made him Count Palatine and Knight of the Golden Spur. He took his only trip to Rome between 1545 and 46. And then in 48 and 50, traveled to Augsburg, where Charles V was residing, where he met actually Philip II, the successor to Charles V. This is shortly before Charles abdicated. And then he died in 1576 as an old man, as you can believe, in Venice. So along with Giorgione, he's considered a founder of the Venetian school of Italian Renaissance painting. And it's absolutely incredible, the huge output. He had a very large workshop. And of course, this is always a debate. Is it by him or by his assistants? He had a particular brush touch, and we'll discuss that in a minute, that evolved quite a bit with age. So here is an early work by him in 1506-7. So he was freshly out of his workshop, and it shows the Christ carrying the cross. This is again one painting that is debated. Some people believe it's by Giorgione and others believe it's Titian, to say again how similar their style were. This was executed for the Church of San Marco. And what is interesting is there is definitely a German influence on that, and could be in great part due to the prints that were brought by Dürer around that period of time to Venice, and where he sold a lot of prints in Venice, made a lot of exchange. In Venice, he was asked early on to work with Giorgione and some other painters in painting the facade of of the Teleco of the Tedeschi. So you have here that facade that still shows in the 18th century frescoes that were painted by Giorgione, Titian, and others on that famous facade. What is interesting is that they finally realized how important these frescoes were, and they detached these frescoes that are now, the few remnants that are still visible are now in the Cadoro, in a little further on the Grand Canal. So the Fondaco de Tedeschi was that center for the German traders. And here is the work attributed to Titian of Judith. And you can see more clearly what it used to be, showing Judith and the head of Holofernes, part of the book of Judith, apocryphal writings, showing that the heroine who's going to save the city, her own city, from the troops of the Philistines, and particularly their commander, Holofernes. So we can see still, though, some pretty good idea of the highlight on the shoulder and the breast of Julius. Another work, sorry, but my mouse is impetuous. This is another early work dating 1510, so that's the year Giorgione died. Shows the half portraits of three men that are gathered together to play music. So in the center, you have an elegantly dressed man with a dark blue fur trim, and you can't see it, unfortunately. You can see the blue fur around the hand, and he's playing on that keyboard. And at the back, at the right, you have a Dominican monk who is another musician. And on the other side, you have the young man with a feathered cap. We don't have any idea who they are, cannot be identified. But again, this was early on believed to be a Giorgione, and then has been later reattributed to Titian. Now, very quickly, Titian showed so much talent that he got some extremely important commission and a whole series of altarpieces. So this is one of the famous early work of his, the Assumption of the Virgin in the Church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari in Venice, showing the very beautiful altarpiece between two of the largest tombs in Venice. And then, of course, has the chance of being illuminated by these beautiful windows. And here, what is really interesting is that it's a new standard of composition by Titian. He now, despite the fact he shows Mary going up on a cloud, there is no really formal separation between the earth, the Virgin, and God, who is waiting for her on the top. This is also, we have to realize, a new tradition for the church, not to show Mary in their mission or die, though dead, as they were showing the death of the Virgin, but now that emphasis on the fact that she went, she didn't die, but went as she was at the time of her Assumption, went all the way to the heaven. This is a very large altarpiece, as you could see. It took him about 2 years to paint. Definitely, when you look at the figures of the apostles, it shows the influence of Michelangelo and some similarities with some of the works of Raphael. How would he know that? Again, it's through the mean of prints that were circulating at that time. So again, you have the apostles, who represents humanity, was stunned by what is happening. And then you have in the middle, the Madonna slight and bathed with light. And then, of course, God at the very top. The representation of Mary owes something to Raphael, but it really is becoming the style of Titian, and of course all the lovely little cherubs that are holding her on her way to heaven. What is interesting is that the patrons were complaining about the size of the apostles, who look really smaller compared to Mary, and Mary going to the heavens. In the same church is the very known, if not even more known work, is the Pesaro altarpiece that was painted a little later than the Assumption. As they said, Titian was never the universal scholar that Leonardo was, nor that outstanding personality as Michelangelo. But he was a painter, and he was a painter who handling of paint equaled Michelangelo mastery of draftsmanship. He, with the age, he really became such a manipulator of the pigment itself that he was known in later age to use his fingers a lot, to just marry one color with the other. Though he was always waiting, he was never working wet and wet, but he would wait until the previous layer was dry before he could go on. And so very often his paintings evolved with the time, because as it was not, he didn't have any preparatory drawing, he could change at his own will some of the details of the painting. This is an amazing painting. It comes in the Santa Maria Gloriosa de Frariet on the left of the church. And here it's really showing the donors. The Pesaro altarpiece bears the name of the donors. And we have the whole family of Pesaro is down here with the young heir to the family. And then the most important here, who is quite important as he played quite a role in the victory over the Turks around that date. And so he is portrayed kneeling before the Virgin, while you have a standard bearer drags a Turkish prisoner. You see the turban there. Now, also there is some symbolism. The two very large columns that you see in the background there shows my throne was in a pillar of cloud. Again, this part of Ecclesiasticus. The Virgin is on these, up on the throne. You have to go up the steps, and you have the patron saints, of course, St. Francis on the left, and St. Peter on, St. Francis on the right and St. Peter on the left. But then you have these clouds with cherubs that are holding the cross. So a lot of symbolism again, but a very dynamic feeling. And this is why Titian, and we'll see next time, Tintoretto and so on, are really the prefiguration of the Baroque movement. So everything becomes much more on a diagonal line than on a triangular, very solid basis as Leonardo. At the close of the 1520s, Titian was considered one of the biggest painter in Venice and around. And this was actually considered one of his finest work. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in a fire. And so this is a copy by Niccolò Casala of the death of St. Peter, martyr, done after the painting of Titian. In Santa Maria della Grazie, della Salute, sorry, Titian painted this very famous altarpiece, The Descent of the Holy Ghost. So it's Pentecost. And you can see all the apostles really overwhelmed by the light of the Holy Spirit, which comes there. And then we have the little flames that are very typical of Pentecost, where they are literally, by that time, certainly they learn languages they didn't know and get the illumination from God. He also made a whole series of tondos that decorate the walls around the altar, and I show you only 3, but there are more. These are the 4 evangelists in Matthew, St. Luke is here, St. Mark, and St. John, with the angel, the bull, the lion, and the eagle. The other tandos were about St. Jerome, St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, and St. Gregory the Great. Other great religious work, the Polyptych of the Resurrection, where you see a very different understanding of the resurrection. We rarely see Christ literally lifted into the sky and then surrounded by Mary on one side. You have the donors on the left was St. George, and then St. Sebastian on the right. But an extraordinary landscape, again, great light coming out of the back, and that very lively representation of Christ, the day of the resurrection. By the way, the image of San Sebastian is inspired by one of the slaves of Michelangelo for the tomb of Julius II. And here we see really a beginning of what's happening in Venice at that time, around 1520. We have some artists that are mannerists that come to the city and are going to change some of the understanding of composition and even coloring for many painters, not for Titian, but definitely the San Sebastian is a very mannerist, has a very mannerist position. Beautiful use of coloring. This is Titian at its best with the Madonna and Child with saints. The saints are Saint Catherine, who is holding Christ, and then the young John the Baptist on the left. This was probably painted for the Duke of Mantua. Again, beautiful landscape in the background. And this is really big change that happens and is literally due to the Flemish contacts. Christ the Redeemer was painted for Francesco Maria della Rovere, Duke of Urbino. And this is very different to the works by Titian around that same period. In contrary to what he was doing normally, in this case, he made a preliminary drawing. And so we see some contours that are much clearer and more defined than normal. When he returned to Venice from Rome in 1546, he created a great group of portraits of the male members of the Vendramin family. And here you have really that beautiful reunion of the young members of the family, the two important ones, and they're kneeling in front of an altar where there should be a relic in that cross. They're probably a relic of the true cross. So this has a direct something to do with the miracle that we saw with Carpaccio earlier, because that relic was owned by the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista. And so here it is actually an ancestor of this family that had donated the relic. Beautiful rendering again of the texture. Glorious clothes by that quite important family in Venice. Titian could be also very sensuous, and the series that he made of paintings on Mary Magdalene is absolutely extraordinary, and this is one of the prettiest. In 61, he had already painted the Mary Magdalene for Philip II, King of Spain. But as many, unfortunately, that painting got lost, and probably in the fire of the Alcazar in the 18th century. Here it is signed on the rock, it's very clear, Titianus. But this is very much a prototype of the Mary Magdalene that exists in many places. Very strong erotic quality. So Mary Magdalene was a good excuse to show very nice and lightly dressed view of the saint. At the time, she is retired in the wilderness. She's shown here barely dressed. She was known, according to the legend, to only be dressed by her long hair. She's there, obviously, in meditation in front of text and with a skull that has directly to do with the vanity of life. And of course, the little jar of oil on the left. It's an absolutely extraordinary painting, again, by the beautiful coloring of the back, the landscape. Though in this case, I would gauge that it needs some cleaning because this should be a much deeper blue. Towards the end of his life, Titian changed drastically the coloring and the handling of the pigment. As I said before, he starts really working with his own fingers, and a lot of fingerprints are found in his paintings at the later day. This is the stunning Martyrdom of Sam Lawrence, with a very deep nocturnal background, just the light of the moon coming through, which is in fact God. The saint that is, of course, has his martyrdom on the grill, literally, is suffering, as you can imagine, is appealing to God in his suffering. And then you have the goddess Vesta, quite interesting, that is facing the temple. Now, he did another version of the same for Philip II, for the Monasterio of the Escorial, Monasterio de San Lorenzo, which is the real name of the Escorial. And of course, the patron saint would be Lawrence. And this is another version of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, where he shows a little more light into it. It's more crowded too, but it's an extraordinary rendering of the fire of the torches. Again, we still have the light coming from the sky, and then the saint into his suffering while his the men are just increasing the power of the fire under. It's just an extraordinary work, and we really see the change in the palette and the rendering of the composition for Titian. This one was the last painting he did, and I was going to move it at the end, and I forgot. Anyway, it shows the Pietà, and it was actually finished. It was unfinished by the time he died, and he had planned for this to be on his tomb at the Frari. So it was completed by Palma il Giovanni, who we'll talk about later on. As you can see again, the coloring is completely changed. The brushwork by that time was incredibly fast and visible. And that's why he's been such an inspiration to Peter Paul Rubens, for example. And from Peter Paul Rubens, this is an influence that goes all the way to the Impressionists. He's a much more lively brush and quick brush also. So to move to another category of painting that Titian was very known for, and even very early on, is portraits. This is an early portrait going back to 1509 of the man with a quilted sleeve. Scholars believe that it depicts Ludovico Ariosto, who was a poet, but now they've changed their mind and they think it was another poet. This was, for example, a painting that influenced Rembrandt quite a bit. The painting was sold at auction while Rembrandt was in Amsterdam, and he had a chance to see it. And this is going to be one of the poses he uses for his own self-portrait in the 17th century. He painted men and women. This is a lovely portrait of Isabella d'Este, though she admits herself that she was not as pretty, and by the time the painting was over, she was much older. But she absolutely loved the painting, and she said that the portrait was so pleasing that I thought that at the age I'm represented, I could have possessed all the beauty it contains. She was, though, an incredibly interesting and strong woman that was a very good administrator, an incredible collector of art, and who withstood next to her husband, who was having affairs, but she stayed strong, and quite a remarkable woman for her age, for the age, I would say. Other portrait, this is the couple of Francesco Maria della Rovere, Duke of Urbino, and his wife Eleonora Gonzaga, who was actually the sister-in-law of Isabella d'Este. Quite an interesting couple. Eleonora Gonzaga was a very interesting figure too, got along extremely well with Isabella d'Este, and is represented here again. You have that opening of the window, typically Flemish, and her little pooch that is sitting there on the windowsill. Francesco Maria della Rovere, the nephew to the Pope of the time, Julius II, and of Julius had already died, but was of the same family, and shown here in full body of armor, though he was not known to be a very strong man. The portrait of Francis I. Titian never met Francis, but was asked to make a portrait. And the way to represent Francis, he was inspired by the medal made by Benvenuto Cellini that you can see on the right, and inspired by that profile, and probably some design of a costume that Francis would wear. He shows the monarch, who was such a monarch in love with Italian Renaissance, with a very Italian costume. While he was in Rome, he really tied some important friendship with the Pope Paul III, very strong ties. And that had started already in 1539. The Farnese family, of course, became, Paul III was a Farnese, was a very powerful family in Rome, as you can imagine. And so he is going to execute different portraits of the Pope and his children and grandchildren. The Pope, before being Pope, the Cardinal Farnese had a very steady relationship with a mistress with whom he had 4 children. Once he knew that he had the chance to become Pope, he broke that relationship, but always took extremely good care of his children and grandchildren. So it's very interesting to see the Pope here. He's already aged, but the look and the position of that aged man, the hands on a book, and the very deep velvet that he carries on his shoulder is absolutely beautiful. He had a difficult reign because he came in Rome just after the sack of Rome in 1527, and so had to try to reestablish the church after that. The portrait of Ranuccio Farnese is absolutely extraordinary. This is one of my very favorite. He was the son of Pier Luigi Farnese. He was the grandson of Pope Paul III. He came to Venice in 1542 to become the prior of San Giovanni dei Forlani, and who belonged to the Knights of Malta. And what you can see is the cross of the Knights of Malta on the side of his outfit, though He's only 12 years old, and you can see already the kind of serious look on his face. He's going to become a knight. This is it. Absolutely extraordinary colors. And there I find Rembrandt, for whatever reason, but Rembrandt could use these red ochres that were extraordinary. Other important figure is the poet and satirist Pietro Argentino. He was a very known poet at the time. As you can see, he's a big man. He has that large, dark, kind of almost maroon coat on a greenish outfit. It had the difficult relationship with Pietro Argentino because he never paid fully the portrait, and then he complained about the fact it wasn't finished, but that was the reason, is that he never gave all the installment about the painting. So quite interesting thing too, that fight between Argentino and Titian. As I mentioned, he met Charles V. This is one of the early portraits of Charles V standing with his dog. He wasn't very tall, but the dog is a big dog. This is one of the earliest surviving example. He did a whole series. This is another one showing Charles V seated. This is when Titian went to Augsburg, where he met with him. He had just had a great victory over the Protestant League at Mühlberg, and so he stayed there for a little while and met the members of the court, and later on he will meet Philip II. You can see Charles V's typical jaw. This is the Habsburg jaw, but in a very simple wooden seat. The first equestrian portrait, this is becoming a very important portrait because it will be copied multiple times with other cavaliers. But this is the first time that an equestrian portrait in painting was really done for representing a ruler. We have portraits in the Dome in Florence too, by Uccello and some earlier, but never with an emperor. This is a very dramatic and monumental portrait, which is really enhancing the stature of Charles V, who, as I mentioned, wasn't a very tall man. Just beautiful rendering of the horse who is rearing, and then the emperor, very pensive. He's going to abdicate only 8 years later. So he's kind of representing the modern St. George. Part of his court is Antoine Perrino de Granvel, who was actually a cardinal, one of the main figures of the court of Charles V, very important figure. He was at that time Bishop of Arras, but he was also a French statesman. Sorry. And here is a portrait a little later of Philip II, just before he took over the power of his father after his abdication. And of course, he's going to become one of the great patrons of the later Titian. Titian also, in becoming the painter to the doors, had as one of the tasks is make a portrait of each of them when they were elected. And so he did make 13 of them, but unfortunately many got burned when the Doge Palace burned down. This is the most extraordinary. And again, here we can see this is 1545. He's already a very mature artist. the incredible brushwork in that rendering of the massive men in that rather large painting. It's 133 centimeters by 103. Absolutely extraordinary strengths of that man, but then the beauty of the conjugation of these ochre colors, red and almost gold, is magnificent. Very severe gaze. This, by the way, was not painted until about 45, and Gritti had died in 38. Very contrasted with that is another of the Doge images, is the Doge Francesco Venier, who was elected Doge in 1554 and only reigned for two years. But this shows how a very different personality. He looks frail. The gaze is not self-assured. And the body itself seems to be very small compared to the previous one. But what is interesting is the landscape through the window, where we see a fire that is unexplained. And then Titian is known for many self-portraits. This is only one of them. But particularly in that period of his life, he made multiple self-portraits of his that are all just magnificent. He's been, for that, an inspiration for Rubens, Poussin, and Velázquez, all alike. Again, look at the touch of red on his hands, then his necklace there, and then you have the highlight on the shirt, at the undershirt. He always had that fur bordered coat on all of his self-portraits. But as I mentioned, he was a versatile painter. So we see wonderful works. This is, we go back in time again. This is 1514. And this is a work that was done for the marriage of one of the main families in, of the two great families in Venice. One is Niccolo Aurelio, who was at that time the vice chancellor of the Venetian Republic, and he's going to marry Laura Bagarato, in 1514. And these can be discovered by shields that are on different vessels. This is probably showing the sacred and profane love. These, again, it's within the marriage. You have both, you have the friendship and the high level of marriage, but you have to have the profane love, because this is part of the reproduction process. But it is incredibly poetic rendering of that, with, of course, beautiful landscape in the background. So the bride is dressed in white, sitting, as you can see. She has Cupid, who is stirring the waves of love, assisted by Venus, who represents the divine love. The different jewels that you see on the vases represent fleeting happiness on earth. And then you have also the burning flame of God's love that symbolizes the eternal happiness in heaven. And she's holding it in her hand there. Beautiful pastoral landscape around with flocks and knights and everything. So there is definitely at that time a fascination with landscape, but also the celebration of marriage, sexual love. This painting was actually offered, the Rothschilds in 1899 offered to buy that work at a price that was higher than any estimate at that time from the Villa Borghese, and they refused, and it remained there. It still is there. Here's the little Cupid, and then you see the low relief on the sarcophagus. Other very cryptic painting is the Allegory of Time Governed by Prudence. again, all kind of theories about it. It shows the three ages of men. You have the old man, middle-aged man, and the young man. You have the wolf, the lion, and the dog. So all kind of symbolism that have to do with, associated with Serapis in Macrobius Saturnalia. Serapis was an Egyptian god that had been created by Ptolemy when he became the leader, the new pharaoh in Egypt. So very interesting. And again, what is really the meaning of this? This seems to be Titian on the left. It could be his son Orazio, and then his young nephew Marco Vecellio. So three people of the same family. One of his most celebrated paintings is, of course, the Venus of Vorbino, showing that young woman on a very beautiful satin sheets. She's in a very similar position to the one by Giorgione, and has that same feeling of very beautiful, creamy flesh. The hand is caressing herself again. And then you have the little dog curled up on the bottom of the bed. But in the background, instead of having a landscape, we now have two servants who are looking in these famous cassone, where the clothes of the mistress would be. She's not a goddess, but she's a nude, and she's a sensual woman. She's a seductress. She's looking at you with a little smile. This is shortly after his wife had died, by the way. So we don't have really the ideal image of female beauty, but clothes. It's always been, again, big question. What is she representing? Is it done again for a marriage? It could be a connection with the wedding of Guidobaldo della Rovere and Giuliana Varano in 1534. And this would have been, again, a symbol of beauty and fertility. Just a comparison. This is the Giorgione versus the Titian. And you can see both of them, by the way, show a little stomach. This is normal at that time, because that was representing the potential of fertility of women, which was everything that was important for a woman. The same sitter is probably the one in that earlier painting of the woman with the fur coat. That shows again that painting very influential. Rubens is going to be influenced by that. Rembrandt is going to be influenced by that. That shows that less plump model that Titian is going to use after the death of his wife. He was, beside these allegorical work, he was asked then to make a whole series of paintings with a mythological subject. He did 3 paintings for Alfonso d'Este at the Duke of Ferrara, and to decorate again that famous cabinet of alabaster for the Duke. And so here is the worship of Venus, showing the goddess here as a statue, and all the little cherubs that go around. And it's really adorable to see all these little guys that are celebrating love, and some are pouting, and some are eating apples. Here is a view of the very severe Castello d'Este, in which actually was the cabinet, where these paintings were hanging. The more known of these three paintings is the meeting of Bacchus and Ariadne. This shows again an incredible life, very strong diagonal from departing from Ariadne on the left to Bacchus, who is transported when he meets Ariadne. What can identify Bacchus is, of course, the leopards that are at the front pulling his cart, and then all that very big company that is around him that either shows the love for wine and grapes, but also dancing and reveling. Ariadne, of course, was at that time, she's showing the little ship, sailing ship that is leaving there, sailing ship with Theseus, who she had helped to escape the island of Crete. And then Theseus very nicely had left her asleep on the island of Naxos, and quickly took his ship and went on to meet his father in Athens. And she woke up very, very sad, crying. And at that time, Bacchus comes by, sees her, falls in love with her, and will marry her. And you can see in the sky the actual constellation of Ariadne, which is actually a crown that he threw in the sky for her. This is summarized. Extraordinary composition, very rambunctious in the sense. The third one is the Bacchanals of the Adrians, the last in the series. This was taken from the works of Philostratus, and represents the people of the Greek island of Andros making merry on the river of wine that Dionysus had created. So again, we have dancing and courting and sleeping, but a lot of revelry. As you see, they enjoyed life, and there was that need of seeing people enjoying life. The beautiful representation of Venus is surely one here, the Venus Anadyomene, which means one who has surfaced. It's a reference to her being born from the sea. You can see the shell actually next to her, and where she has her long hair trying to dry up her hair. She just rose from the ocean in Paphos on Cyprus, or Citra. This is a rather small painting, but it's absolutely beautiful figure, typical of the 1510 and 20s. We're moving ahead. The Venus with the mirror. This is also a very influential painting. There's that subject taken back by Rubens. And he's definitely influenced there by Giovanni Bellini with the woman with the mirror. Extraordinary rendering of the fabrics. He then will receive, and I'll have to go rather fast on that, he will receive from Philip II the commission for a series of paintings that have to do with poetry. They also call favole in Italian, and all subjects that are mythological scenes and allegories with very strong erotic elements, mostly drawn from the Ovid's Metamorphoses. They started reaching Philip in 54. This is Danae with the nurse, and the last ones will be sent by the mid-60s, 1562, the Rape of Europa, etc. There is, I'm showing, this is joining a collection that already was owned by Philip. But that was commissioned by his father, Charles V, collection of mythological pieces by Correggio that I showed last time, including the beautiful Jupiter and Io. So they come typically in pendant, depending on the room they were going to go. They would correspond to one another. On the left is the first one he did on Danae with the servant, and you can see Danae, who Jupiter fell in love with, and is actually reaching his goal by showering her with rain of gold. And you can see the servant trying to catch some of the gold. This is, of course, quite an allegory for closer encounter. On the right, you have Venus and Adonis. The goddess of love that falls in love with Adonis, the beautiful muse, but her love is not enough to stop him pursuing his favorite pastime, which was hunting. And of course, she's going to have her revenge in getting him gored to death by a boar. Very free brushwork at that time, beautiful handling of the pigment, and as I mentioned, a lot by hand. This is two pendants again, Diana and Actaeon. This is the young huntsman who comes on the scene of Diana having her bath by pure coincidence that's going to cost him his life. And then on the right, Diana and Callisto. Where you have that rivalry between the goddess and a nymph. Towards the end, this is very much that contrast that we have between the colorito versus disegno. Venice becomes the capital of the color versus the design. And here in the famous Rape of Europa, where we see the white bull taking off, this is Jupiter in disguise taking off with Europa. And then as a pendant, the death of Actaeon on the right. This is when Actaeon is transformed into a deer and then killed by his own dogs. The last two are Perseus and Andromeda, where Andromeda is going to be saved by Perseus when she's condemned to die by her family. And then Tarquin and Lucretia, which is that rape to save, where Lucretia is going to be raped by Tarquin to save her family before she commits suicide. The last work by him is one of the last works, is the Flaying of Marcias. And this is an incredible story. That's that contest between Marcias, who is a faun, a satyr, and who tells Apollo that he's a better musician than him. And of course, you don't ever say that to a god. He doesn't succeed, and the punishment is to be flayed alive. And it's a terrible image where he's attached by the hind legs to a tree, and they're starting to cut him off different parts of the body. Very difficult view. It was found in his house and kept that painting. He worked in the summer of 76 and was devastated because his favorite son Orazio died in the plague that year. So in there you have the King Midas, who is the judge of the contest, and he actually has the features of Titian. Very quickly, I'm going to move to Palma Vecchio because I want to show, he worked with them. He was always overwhelmed by the works of Titian and his fame and his success. But it's really interesting because you can see the legacy of Palma Vecchio, called Vecchio the Old because his nephew was Palma the Young. And so to differentiate them, they call that. He was really influenced by the works of Titian and was born in Bergamo, but died in Venice in 1528. And just show you a few works by him. This is a portrait of a poet, which I think is absolutely beautiful. Very much, I think, influenced also by Giorgione. Here, very much a kind of an allegory again, where you have a soldier, so-called soldier, but in fact, because of the flock there, is probably a shepherd. And then the figure of a woman, and it's very difficult to know exactly what is meant there, and then two cherubs who embrace one another. A beautiful altarpiece, the Polyptych of Santa Barbara. This was commissioned by the Confraternity of the Artillerymen. Beautiful sacred conversation. Parma did some absolutely great work, but when you live with the sun next to you, you are a small star, and though the handling of the colors is superb. So next time, on the Tuesday, we will look at the phenomenal energy of Tintoretto, the brilliance of Veronese, and the wisdom of Palladio. We'll talk also a little bit about the Venetian mannerists. So I hope, I'm sorry, I went a little over my time as usual. I'm going to stop the recording.